Jesus turns the water into wine and has a very strange conversation with his mother. What does it mean? That will be the subject of this video. Before we read the story of the marriage at Cana and the things that Jesus did there, you need to understand that there are basically 5 points of reference, 5 different contexts that we use to try to interpret the major features of this story. Adam and Eve in the garden at the beginning of the book of Genesis, the children of Israel at Mount Sinai to receive the law in Exodus 19, prophetic passages of abundance in the Messianic age, particularly the abundance of wine, and also 2 stories here in John's Gospel that are intimately linked with what he does in Cana when Jesus purifies the temple, the very next story, and also his passion narrative, but particularly his resurrection. There are so many ambiguous and interesting things that take place at the marriage at Cana, but basically, these are the 5 reference points that we are going to run to explain this story. And so it would be good to have these in your mind, to have this preloaded in advance so that things make a lot more sense to you as we read. You should know what we are looking for. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what to me and to you?" Now, that is a very literal translation of the Greek. We will analyze this in some detail. I understand that in many English translations, it might say something like, "What does that have to do with me?" But literally in Greek, he tells her, "What to me and to you? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every one serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Scholars have proposed a number of locations as Cana of Galilee, but generally there are 2 that are considered. This is Khirbet Cana, and it is 9 miles north of Nazareth. Now, you can see here at the bottom left of the screen that archaeologists have put this area back together well enough to at least give us a basic sketch outline of where things would have been positioned relative to one another. The second location is Kephakana, and it is 3.5 miles northeast of Nazareth. And you can see in this picture that it's an urban stretch and a lot of homes and businesses, and so very limited in what archaeologists can do, because if they go to digging under these settlements, they will destabilize the settlements. And here's the map. You can see here that the first picture we saw, Khirbet Kana, that is the red dot, 9 miles north of Nazareth, and the blue dot is Kephakana, the second picture, the urban stretch filled with homes and businesses. One of the most interesting features of this story is its temporal note, that this was on the 3rd day. Now, at first glance, that doesn't really make sense, but as we analyze it, it likely plugs us back into the story of creation. It says, on the 3rd day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now, as we look over the story of John's Gospel so far, he has been careful to list out the days for us. I haven't paid attention to this in previous videos because I was waiting to get to this point to kind of tie it all together. Now, it's interesting how this works. Day number 1 was verses 19 through 28 in the first chapter. And this is when John testifies to the priests and Levites that he is not the Christ, just one who prepares the way. And then in verse 29 it says, on the next day, this is day 2. This is when Jesus approaches John at the Jordan River and the Spirit ascends on him. Then in verse 35 it will say, on the next day. This is when Jesus walks by John. John witnesses about Jesus, and 2 of John's disciples go to follow Jesus. And then later on in that day, Simon Peter goes to follow Jesus. So at this point, day 3, Jesus has 3 disciples. And then it says, on the next day. On this day, Jesus and his disciples go to Galilee, where Philip and Nathanael will become followers of Jesus. And so we've seen so far that Jesus has 5 followers. And John is not going to bother to record for us the calling stories of the remaining 12 disciples or any of the folks outside the 12. We've just had the narration of 5 disciples that came to follow Jesus. So that left us on day 4. This is why it's so striking here that it says on the 3rd day. Well, we've already had 4 days. How could this be on the 3rd day? Now, no one thinks that we've shot back to day 3 here because that day was already full of events and travel and whatnot, and we can't really put any more into it. And so when he says on the 3rd day, that must mean the 3rd day from day 4, where we left off in the previous chapter. So we were on day 4. Now, the 3rd day from that would not be day 7. It would be day 6, because on the 3rd day means that we're going to count the last day that was mentioned. So here we have day 4 when Jesus calls Philip and Nathanael to follow him. The 3rd day from that means that we count day 4 as a new day 1, and then there's day 5, then there's day 6. All right, so on the 6th day, that's when the wedding at Cana in Galilee occurs. And a number of scholars have pointed this out. Why would this be so significant? Well, let's remember what John's gospel is like so far. He opens with in the beginning, which is the same way that the book of Genesis opens. And if you've seen the previous videos covering chapter 1, there are so many echoes and allusions to the book of Genesis, and particularly the creation story, that this is not going to be an accident. Now, what happened on day 6 in the book of Genesis, in the creation story? Well, you have the first wedding, Adam and Eve, the first married couple in human creation. So what does John have here happening on day 6 in his narrative? Well, Jesus is going to be at a wedding, right? So this is the book of Genesis all over again. In the book of Genesis, you have a wedding on day 6, Adam and Eve. And so now we have a wedding here on day 6 at the beginning of John chapter 2. And so this means that John has gone out of his way to structure the story of Jesus to reflect the creation days in Genesis, because he wants us to pay attention here. He says that the book of Genesis is going to be the key to resolving this story. Now, some folks who are knowledgeable in ancient Jewish things have suggested that this just means the 3rd day of the week, and that's all we have here. We don't have a Genesis allusion. Well, this isn't going to be quite right, because virgins were married on the 4th day of the week, Wednesday, and widows were married on the 5th day of the week, Thursday. And so if this was a day of the week, it would be Tuesday if it's just the 3rd day of the week, which is the wrong day for a wedding. So that's not going to work. What we have here is the 3rd day since the 4th day, which makes this the 6th day. This is a new book of Genesis that John is trying to write for us. And Jesus is the centerpiece, the agent of this new creation. Now we want to consider the other explanatory matrix for this story, the children of Israel and the establishment of the covenant at Mount Sinai. Everything the Lord has said, we will do. This is the oath by which the children of Israel bind themselves to the Lord in their covenant at Mount Sinai. Compare this with this line. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now, it makes sense to connect these two statements between John and Exodus, because look at all the allusions to Exodus 19 so far. In the previous chapter, we've seen a number of texts alluded to. Uh, Moses saying he wants to see God's glory hid in the cleft of the rock, all the talk about the Shekinah glory cloud of God that appeared at Mount Sinai, and how that's Jesus, specific references to Moses giving the law. I mean, there has been a lot of Mount Sinai stuff leading up to this point. And here we have Jesus' mother. Do whatever he tells you. This sounds like the people at Mount Sinai. And in terms of the temporal note of it being on the third day, this also occurs in Exodus 19. Be ready for the third day, for on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Deuteronomy tells us that the Lord appears on Mount Sinai in his awesome power and reveals his glory. So here Jesus comes to this wedding at the third day, and in verse 11 it's going to specifically say that he manifested his glory. So now he sounds like Yahweh, establishing the covenant at Mount Sinai. In the cloud that was over Mount Sinai at the giving of the law, the Shekinah cloud, uh, the Jews would come to understand this as a kind of huppah, a canopy under which you stand when you are getting married. And so here we have this Mount Sinai language, and this language of the cloud, this language of glory. And it is in the context, again, of a wedding. I found this interesting in some of the Catholic interpreters, Martin and Wright, and I'm not Catholic, but I have uh, been doing a lot of study on Catholic interpretations of John's Gospel. It's interesting something they put in a footnote. They didn't even put this in the body of the text because it is kind of reaching and it is kind of strange. But in the passage in Exodus, and he said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. This is how they prepared themselves for this event. And Jesus said to her, talking to his mother, woman, what to me and to you? My hour has not yet come. Now, this statement from Jesus to his mother, we're going to analyze this in a lot more detail here in a few moments, but I just found this kind of interesting. I think it's a stretch. I'm not really persuaded by this, but it is interesting. Do not go near a woman. And then Jesus specifically refers to his mother as woman and creates some kind of distance between them. Uh, just interesting at most. Maybe there's something to it, but I do doubt it. The wedding is on the third day. The only two places where third or three occur in John is an inclusio for the 3 days that holds this chapter together. Remember, an inclusio is when something begins and ends with the same thing. Sometimes a section in a gospel will begin and end with something, and that kind of marks it off as being its own section. Chapter 2 begins with, on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and it ends with Jesus saying, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The only places where three or third day occur in John's gospel, right here with these two stories that are back to back. As Keener says, the purpose of this inclusio is to bind the two paragraphs together so that they interpret one another. So whatever the meaning is here in Cana of Galilee is going to be reflected in Jesus ransacking the temple. These two stories must interpret one another. If we come up with radically different interpretations of these two stories, we're probably in the wrong, because John has connected these, not just in sequence, they're back to back, but also connected them with this phrase, the third day, because he intends for these two stories to interpret one another. And this means that the wine must point to the resurrection. When he ransacks the temple and they want an explanation, he says, tear down this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up again, speaking of his resurrection. And so the wine here must in some way point to the new life upon which the new covenant is based. Jesus' assault on the temple must be read in conjunction with Jesus setting aside ceremonial pots in Cana. It's not just resurrection, but it's the resurrection of Jesus is better. It is a replacement for something else. There's a constant polemic against the way that the Jews, and the Pharisees in particular, have made ceremonial cleansing with water sort of the catch-all of the religious experience. And Jesus here has taken the water pots that were used for ceremonial washing, and he has replaced the water with wine. He's replaced the old with something new. He's replaced something that wasn't very joyful with something joyful. And in the symbolism, it is likely that he has replaced Jewish ceremonial washing with the joy and the power of his resurrection. Verse 3, when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Now, is this a small deal or is it a big deal? We are misreading this story if we think this is a small deal. This is, in fact, a very serious problem. The groom was responsible for such things, and his whole family would have been disgraced. Hospitality was very important in the ancient world, and weddings were among the most serious of social obligations. Some even think his family could have been sued by the bride's family for such a thing. This was a desperate situation. So when Mary says, "Oh, they've run out of wine," this isn't, kind of a light statement of, "Oh man, the party's not over. Sure wish they had a bit more alcohol to really spice things up a bit." That's not what's going on here. In the social conventions of this time and place, this is a really big deal, and shame in your community is a really big deal in the ancient world. And so she is concerned for protecting their honor at this crucial moment in their lives. Now, we want to look beyond the social situation to the deeper theological meaning, because everything that's taking place here, while it must make sense on a literal social and historical level, there's a lot of theological messaging going on here. There's a lot of symbolism. This story is both a historical event and it's a kind of a symbolic parable about the kingdom of God. "They have no wine" is not simply a comment by Mary about the panic of the wedding's host. It is a theological statement about the Judaism that is now meeting its Messiah. Jesus is about to demonstrate the obsolescence of Judaism's religious forms. And so Gary Burge here is looking ahead, to the next few verses where it's the ceremonial water pots that are going to be transformed from holding water to holding wine, representing Judaism's religious forms taking a hike because something better has arrived. Now, Mary here, is she the mediatrix? Again, I am not Catholic, but I wanted to kind of share with the audience in case they're curious, because this passage has been a source of controversy between Protestants and Catholics and the role that Mary plays here. Now, in Catholicism, Mary as mediatrix means that she is going to do two things. And I'm going to quote St. Thomas Aquinas, who says that Mary assumed the role of a mediatrix in two ways. First, she intercedes with her son. Right? The people have a need, and so she presents these needs to Jesus on their behalf. So when Catholics pray to Mary, and then she goes and intercedes for them, this is the passage they point to. Look, Mary here is interceding on behalf of the people at the wedding. And so they understand this passage as establishing her function in the kingdom as that of mediatrix, as a kind of intercessor. And in the second place, Aquinas continues, she instructs the servants. And so Catholics will insist that the function of Mary is not so that she can point to herself and glorify herself, that she is always pointing people to Jesus. And so here she takes the needs of the people to Jesus, and she also points them to Jesus. And so they say this is kind of a biblical proof text to defend some of their thinking on Mary. And so again, I am not Catholic, and obviously I'm not going to read Mary in a Catholic way. But if you were ever curious about the biblical texts that Catholics use, well, this is one of the main ones. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what to me and to you? My hour has not yet come." This is also a very controversial statement here, that Jesus would talk to his mother this way. What does this mean? Well, we're going to divide it into three parts. The part where he calls her woman, the part where he says, "What to me and to you," and the part where he says, "My hour has not yet come." Let's begin with woman. Woman was a typical way of addressing women in antiquity and need not imply disrespect. Obviously, in our time, if you call a woman woman, you're being very disrespectful, very sexist. People will not take kindly to this. But this is just a classic case of we cannot impose the modern world upon the ancient text. Jesus will refer to the Samaritan woman as woman over in John chapter 4. And there he does not seem to be disrespecting her. And Jesus is also going to call his mother woman again in chapter 19 when he is on the cross and he hands her over into the care of one of his disciples. Obviously, there's a great deal of love and pathos in that scene. And it wouldn't make any sense to think that Jesus just took his last few moments on the cross to disrespect his mother by calling her woman. And so, whatever this means, whatever it means to call her woman, uh, disrespect is not going to be one of the possible options. But we do need an explanation because even though people refer to women as woman in the ancient world, there is no extant evidence of anyone calling their mother woman. Right? Jesus is the only one we know of who does this. And so there must be some kind of meaning here. And there is an interpretation of this that I think has a lot of strength. And we'll talk about this more later in this lesson. But going back to Augustine, he says that Mary had to learn that her relationship to Jesus as disciple was more important than her relationship to him as mother. And so Mary is kind of uh, undergoing an evolution in her understanding. She's used to seeing Jesus as her biological son under her authority. She has a maternal relationship to Jesus, but now she needs to see him as Lord, and that he has a kind of autonomy that she has to accept. Martin and Wright, these are Catholic interpreters, and I'm sharing Catholic interpreters on this specific subject because I don't want Catholics to watch this and think that because I'm Protestant, I'm being anti-Catholic. I want you to see that Catholics have seen it this way also. Jesus, in a certain sense, distances himself from an exclusive mother-son relationship, as he is recorded to have done in the Synoptics. So many of our characters, they are historical persons, but they're also symbols. They are undergoing this process of growing in discipleship. And this is Mary's process in this gospel, that she has to learn to see Jesus as Lord and not as her son. And there are other dimensions and nuances to this that we'll come back to. In the book of Revelation, there is a woman there who is the mother of the Messiah and also his bride. And she is a symbol for the people of God, both Israel before the establishment of the new covenant and Israel continued in the form of the church after the establishment of the new covenant. And this woman appears twice in the book of Revelation. And in both places, she is a woman of heavenly identity. She's standing in the sun with the moon under her feet in chapter 12. And then in Revelation 21, she's coming down out of heaven. In both instances, she begins in heaven, but then comes down to the earth. In both instances, she is received by the earth. The earth is happy to receive her. The number 12 is associated with her, the number of God's people, 12 stars on her head. When she shows up in Revelation 21 and 22, she's a woman and she is also a city, and she has 12 gates, 12 foundation stones, etc. She is oppressed by the dragon, that is Satan, in chapter 12. Because when the woman occurs in chapter 12, it's to show the church in history when it is oppressed. When the woman shows up in the new heavens and the new earth in chapter 21 and 22, it's to show the woman when she is not oppressed, because we are beyond human history. We have moved into eternity. She is fleeing into the wilderness in chapter 12, and she is safely placed on a mountain in Revelation 21 and 22, because there is no more a need to hide. But in chapter 12, she is mother. Here, she is wife. Now, the reason I am pointing this out is because the book of Revelation is a Johannine document. It comes from John. And in this book, in Revelation, when you have a symbol that is Jesus' mother and his wife, and then we go into the Gospel of John, Mary is clearly his mother, but there is some talk as to whether or not on a symbolic or a parabolic level, Mary also functions to be his bride. That is not an incestuous idea. No one is being literal about this. But this notion that Mary in this story may represent the church, uh, that is definitely a possibility since the same woman is mother and wife in John's other big book. This may be the case here as well. And I want to share how this idea would work. We've talked about how the creation story and the marriage in the book of Genesis is recurring here, just in kind of a new version. And we are going to see, I think, indisputably shortly, that Jesus is the true bridegroom at this marriage, that historically there is another kind of groom, but Jesus is going to take on the role and function of groom at the marriage because it was the groom's job to supply the wine. Well, Jesus is going to supply the wine. Well, now we need to know who's the bride at the wine. Who is the new Eve? Well, Mary seems to be the new Eve at this wedding for a number of reasons. Eve is called mother and woman in the book of Genesis. Well, Jesus specifically calls her woman, and John introduces the story not by referring to Mary's name, but by calling her mother. All the language that was used of Eve is now being used of Mary, and this may explain why Jesus calls his mother woman, and we don't have any other evidence of someone in the ancient world calling their mother woman. People didn't call their mothers woman. But Jesus will here, for the sake of gathering these nuances from the book of Genesis, helping us to understand that Mary here is a kind of Eve. Jesus will be in a garden at the end of this gospel. Now, you may not have realized that when Jesus is crucified and buried and resurrected, John's gospel is the only gospel to specifically tell us it was in a garden. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not say that it was the Garden of Gethsemane. They say Gethsemane, but they don't say it's a garden. Now, he's placing Jesus in a garden because Adam, the world's first husband, was placed in a garden. Specifically, again, only this gospel, someone is going to see Jesus resurrected, Mary Magdalene, and they're going to say, well, she thought he was a gardener. Well, why? Why is that important? Well, it's not important just because she had this misunderstanding. She's like, oh, well, that must be the gardener. No. John always has another meaning, a deeper meaning. He's saying that Jesus is like Adam. He is a gardener. Jesus is crucified on Friday, the day that Adam is made. And this is the gospel where Pontius Pilate says, behold the man. And it's in this context where there's all this Adam stuff going on. We're going to have this garden. We're going to have Jesus. Someone's going to think he's the gardener. But when he's called the man, it's this sense of him being the new man, the new Adam. Right? Just as Adam sort of represented an entire branch of humankind, so Jesus will represent this whole other branch of humankind. Just think of Paul's discussion in Romans 5 on how Jesus is the new Adam. Finally, this is the only gospel where Jesus' side is opened for his bride. Remember that in the synoptic gospels, there is no talk about water coming out of Jesus' side after he is pierced by a spear. This whole business about Jesus being stabbed, that is only in the Gospel of John. And it's in this context where there's all this other stuff from the Garden of Eden taking place. Well, how did Adam receive his bride? Well, he went to sleep and his side was opened, and God took his bride out of his side. Well, here, Jesus is going to go to sleep, as it were. He's going to die, and then his side is going to be opened, and the water and blood representing the Holy Spirit and the blood of the atonement is going to pour out. And from this, life is given to his bride, is given to the church, which Eve, or rather Mary here as the new Eve, is a symbol of this. She is both mother and bride, the way the church is both mother and bride in the book of Revelation. Well, how would we understand this then? Well, it's not just simply that Mary is Eve all over again, but rather she's a better version of Eve. We've already seen some of this in chapter 1, where Nathaniel is Jacob, but he's a better version of Jacob. So now Mary is Eve, but a better version of Eve. Mary is the new Eve of the new creation week. But she is not under the influence of the serpent. She does not deceive or disobey, and does not desire the fruit of the forbidden tree for herself, but rather she asks for others to receive the fruit of the wine that represents the Messianic kingdom. Now, I think that the fact that this wedding occurs on the sixth day, there have been all these echoes of the book of Genesis. Jesus is definitely going to be depicted as the bridegroom. We'll talk more about that later. And that in the book of Revelation, John's other document, you know, Jesus' mother is also his bride. Well, that would make sense here too, since he's calling her woman, the same language that is used of Eve in the book of Genesis. There's just so much piling up that suggests, yeah, we have a new creation week here. And in Mary, once again, it's the fruit of the vine. She's talking about wine, but this isn't deception. This isn't the fall. This is the beginning of the new covenant. And so I think that Mary's role here, one of her roles here, is to catalyze this point about new creation, new book of Genesis, these things being brought to bear by her son Jesus. He says, "Woman, what to me and to you?" We want to focus on this idiom here, this saying, what to me and to you, because this is common throughout the Bible. We find it in a number of places. Now, I'm reading Klink here. He says, what can be clearly determined from the use of the idiom's range of uses is that it is intending to serve as a distancing response by one party to a request or expectation from another party. The level of distancing can range from hostility to simple disengagement. So when he says this, what to me and to you, he is definitely creating some distance. The question is, how hostile is it? Is it simple disengagement or is it true hostility? Well, context is the best teacher. But before we consider more about the immediate context of the wedding at Cana, we want to look at how this idiom is used throughout the Old Testament. 2 Samuel. Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head." So someone is throwing rocks at David, and David isn't responding with hostility. And so Abishai is like, "Come on, let me go and kill this guy." Verse 10, but the king said, "What to me and to you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, 'Curse David,' who then shall say, 'Why have you done so?'" So David here doesn't seem to be, hateful toward his soldier, but it is a passage where he's creating distance, and there is an element of rebuke here to this guy who's throwing rocks. I like this illustration here because you can see Abishai here is he can hardly put up with it. He really wants to go kill this guy, and David is not on board. Here is very much a type of Christ in the sense that he is willing to receive damage without dishing it back out. Now, here's an example from the life of Elijah. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, "What to you and to me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." And he said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him from her arms and carried him up into the upper chambers where he lodged. Now notice when she says this, she says, "Oh man of God." She honors him in the sense that she acknowledges who he is, but at the same time, she's pretty upset, right? So there's like a combination here. It's not full-blown hatred. There's still an element of respect, but she's obviously very hurt by this, and he thinks that she's been bad for her. Well, he doesn't take it too personally. He takes her son and kills him. So here's another one of these ambiguous uses of the idiom. Now, the last two examples have been examples of kind of respectful disengagement, but now we have an example here of strong disrespect with Elisha. And Elijah said to the king of Israel, "What to me and to you? Go to the prophets of your father and to the prophets of your mother." But the king of Israel said to him, "No, it is the Lord who has called these three kings to give them into the hand of Moab." And Elijah said, "As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, were it not that I have regard for Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would neither look at you nor see you." So the idiom definitely can be used in a context of hostility. Now, other than John chapter 2 and Jesus speaking to his mother, All examples of this idiom involve demons speaking to Jesus. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." Now, because it's a demon speaking to Jesus, we might automatically go, oh, well, this is a strong statement of rejection and rebuke and disrespect. Well, I don't know. Son of the Most High God, and then he begs him for more time because he doesn't want to be tormented. It seems to me that this isn't really disrespect, but he is certainly trying to create some distance and trying to say, hey, you're here too early. I'm not supposed to be tormented yet. So we have some examples of strong rebuke, such as when Elisha rebukes the king of Israel. But more oftentimes, this phrase creates a kind of distance that doesn't necessarily have to be disrespectful. And as we continue our story and analyze the interaction between Jesus and Mary, it does not seem to be disrespectful, though there is a kind of distance created, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, to look at this and say, what to me and to you, woman, what to me and to you, and to be like, man, he told her off. Well, that's probably not right. That's an unnecessary conclusion. And I'm not Catholic, but it would be concerning if Jesus disrespected his mother because of the Ten Commandments to honor your parents. And so we don't really want to go that route. And the idiom and the context of the story and the larger context of the Old Testament and the New Testament do not require that we take Jesus as disrespecting her. Indeed, of all the scholars I read, Protestant and Catholic, no one thought that. No, professional exegete said, hey, Jesus is telling off his mother. No, nobody took it that way. That would be very unnecessary. Then finally he tells her, my hour has not yet come. Jesus' hour doesn't begin in this gospel until the Passion narrative in chapter 12, when he is given the farewell address to his disciples the night that he is betrayed. So you can see here in chapter 7, they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Well, that will change in chapter 12. My soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I have come to this hour. In chapter 17, right before he's crucified, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you. So whatever she seems to be asking for, Jesus thinks it's inappropriate, that it's too early, because his hour is not arriving until the final 24 hours or so of his life. We want to be mindful of wine throughout the Bible. Isaiah 25, when he's talking about the coming kingdom. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. The wine in this story, in John 2, the wine could be understood as the Eucharistic wine, which he tells Mary, "My hour has not yet come." Well, if the hour deals with the last of his life, well, there could be meaning here. It's not his time to provide the wine of the Eucharist. That is something that's coming later, though he will give kind of a preview of that by doing this miracle. He'll at least do that for her, but he's not going to reveal the Eucharistic wine. Now, that is somewhat difficult because when you get to the night of Jesus' betrayal in this gospel, it's the only gospel where he does not take wine and say, well, this is my blood, or take bread and say, this is my body. And so that one's kind of hard to buy for me. It could refer to the blood that flows from Jesus' side. It's not time for that. That is the true wine. Or the joy of the Messianic age that comes with the resurrection. Now remember that this wine story is linked with building up the temple in 3 days with resurrection. And so I think that this wine here is kind of a metonym to tie us into resurrection and the joy of the new life. And the resurrection is oftentimes depicted in the Bible, the age to come, as a great dinner with plenty to eat and drink. The wine seems to go hand in hand with the resurrection. And when you look here in Isaiah 25 and verse 8, he will swallow up death forever, right after talking about all this wine. And so that's what I think the wine basically represents, is resurrection. Verse 5 is kind of hard to understand because it's hard to see how this verse follows verse 4. Verse 4, Jesus says to his mother, "Woman, what to me and to you? My hour is not yet come." And then his mother immediately turns to the servants and says, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, what about Jesus' statement to her would make her think that the servants need to get ready because something's about to happen? It's really strange. There's kind of this disconnect. I mean, he creates some distance. He says the time isn't here yet, and then she tells the servants to get ready. And it's kind of hard to see how verse 5 logically follows verse 4. How did Mary take the statement of Jesus? What is she doing here? What is her understanding of the moment? She understands Jesus to be saying, "I don't want to do it, but I will." Maybe she's just confident that even though he's not in agreement, uh, he's going to do it just for her sake. It could be that he doesn't want to reveal his hour, uh, but in order to humor her, to concede to her, to do what she wants, and to salvage, the honor of those who are putting on this wedding, he will at least give a preview of the coming hour, right? Whether we understand that hour, the wine of that hour, to be the Eucharistic wine, the blood from his side, or the joy of a resurrection, whatever the case may be, he just does this for her sake, but also for the kingdom. He's not His hour has not yet arrived, but he'll at least give you a sign that reveals the coming hour. Klink says the very expression of the love of God, that would be Jesus, he's this expression of the love of God, would certainly be able to incorporate into his mission to the world the situation of the people, especially his mother, with whom he now dwells. So even though the hour is not yet arrived, Jesus is sensitive to his mother, he is sensitive to the people around him, and so he will incorporate a kingdom relevant sign of what is to come, a kingdom relevant sign of what is to come for the benefit of being compassionate and accommodating those around him. It seems that Mary has this kind of understanding, and that is why she tells the servants to do these things, which means that she likely did not understand, again, Jesus' statement, "What to me and to you," as being very disrespectful. Very quickly, in terms of Old Testament typology, there seems to be a connection here between Joseph and Jesus when it says, "Do whatever he tells you." This is what Pharaoh tells his household in relationship to Joseph. And this creates this typological connection. Joseph was betrayed by a man named Yehuda for silver, just as Jesus is betrayed by Judas, which is Yehuda in Hebrew. He's betrayed by Yehuda for silver. There's this close connection here. Joseph is thrown into a pit and raised out, and he becomes ruler over the world, third after Pharaoh, just as Jesus, he's thrown into the pit of his death, resurrected, and then he has authority over the world. All authority in heaven and earth, he says, has been given to him in Matthew's gospel. And so it's just very interesting that there may be this connection. And remember, Joseph supplied in a time of famine. People were out of food, and he provided food. Well, now here, people are out of wine, and Jesus provides the wine. And so he seems to be functioning at the wedding here as a kind of new Joseph. Now there were 6 stone jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Earthen jars that were made unclean were to be broken, but not stone jars. So a jar made of earth, a clay jar or something. If it's unclean, if something unclean touches it, and now it's going to spread uncleanness around, and if you get unclean, then you can't go to the temple, you can't be in the presence of the Lord or in the presence of priests who are going to go into the temple. Well, an earthen jar would be broken, but stone jars were impervious to ceremonial contamination. This is why the Jewish people would like stone jars, because they never are unclean. And so that's probably the reason why these jars are made of stone. Now, the superabundance of 120 to 180 gallons of wine hints at a meaning beyond a mere historical wedding. I've been trying to say that this is a historical wedding, but it is also a symbol for the kingdom of God. And that kind of wine is much more than they would have needed for this wedding. And again, this gets us with Old Testament expectations of the Messianic age. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. Jesus is giving a preview of of the kingdom to come, to what comes as a result of his resurrection, the resurrection life that we now lead, and the great resurrection of the body that we will experience in the age to come. Could it have something to do with Moses? At Sinai, Moses gave them water from a stone, but Jesus gives wine from stone jars. That may be why we have stone jars mentioned here, because we're supposed to make a comparison. He is like Moses, but greater than Moses. He doesn't give water from the stone, he gives wine from the stone. Remember, the comparisons between Jesus and Moses started early, for the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Moses accuses, but Jesus gives eternal life. It will say that in John chapter 5. Bread came through Moses, but Jesus is the true bread that comes down from heaven. It will say that in chapter 6. Wine is specifically mentioned in Jewish tradition as a substance that must not be mixed with water if it is to be valid for purification. And so, what an offense that he would take this, purification water and totally turn it into wine. And also in chapter 4, the Samaritan woman will leave the water pitcher behind. Some have seen the specific reference to her leaving the water pitcher behind as kind of emblematic of what Jews and Samaritans need to do when they meet Jesus. It's no longer about your purifications. You have the new life of the resurrection. And it's not even about the Old Testament law anymore. Jesus is greater than Moses. He doesn't cancel the law of Moses, but he gives a fuller and more complete version of God's law through his teachings and his life and example. And he said to them, "Now draw some of it and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. Now, I highlighted this point here because, again, this is not just a wedding, it is a symbol of kingdom life. The servants who trust and obey will later get the privilege of knowing what others do not know. The people at this wedding here, they don't know that Jesus did this. Jesus is, of course, his mother and his disciples know. But outside of his mother and his disciples, only the servants who obey get to know. And I think there is a point here that the greatest revelations of God, the things that God is doing, this is largely reserved for those of us who obey. It's through obedience that we get to a place where God is willing to reveal with us what he is doing. In verse 10, the master of the feast says to the bridegroom, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people are feeling the effects, then the poor wine is served, but you have kept the good wine until now." What he means by this is you have a bunch of wine, and it is alcoholic wine, and the stuff that tastes good, you serve that first. And then after people are buzzed and their palates are dull and they don't care much about the taste, then you bust out the wine that is kind of bitter. Now, when it says that after the people are feeling the effects, this is the Greek word metheo. You may discern that our English word methamphetamine comes from this word. Obviously, though, within the context of ancient Greek, it's talking about the effects of alcohol, not a stimulant like methamphetamine or some other stimulant. Obviously, meth does not exist in the ancient world. The ancient Greek word for metheo, for the effects of alcohol, shows up in other places. Jesus refers to the one who begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards. Same lemma there. Acts chapter 2, "For these men are not drunk as you suppose, for it is only the third hour of the day." 1 Corinthians, "For in your eating each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry and another is drunk." And so this word definitely means alcohol. And, the people at this wedding, if they've already gone through all the wine, they're definitely buzzing. I mean, there's no getting around that. There's some alcohol being consumed here. But the wine that Jesus gives them tastes very good. And that's why they're like, "Oh, this is the wine we drink at first. That tastes good and it gets us buzzed, so we don't care if we drink crappy wine later." That's the kind of wine that Jesus has given them. So they're impressed that the best wine comes later, just as Jesus comes after Moses or Jesus comes after John the Baptist. The best stuff comes later. Now, alcohol within the context of Galilee, not surprising. 7 or more Galilean cities and villages were heavily engaged in wine production, which constituted one of Galilee's primary industries. Wine was often mixed with 2 or 4 parts water and 1 part wine. In other words, when you drank your water and your wine, your wine would either be 1/5 of the cup or it would be 1/3 of your cup. Um, that's how that goes. They didn't usually just drink straight wine or strong drink. It usually was diluted by water. And there definitely is, some conscientiousness concerning alcohol in the Bible. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who is complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who tarry long over the wine. Passages like this make people go, hey, what's going on, with these marriages at Cana? Don't these people read the book of Proverbs? Don't they know that Jewish people are not supposed to sit around for days at a time and just drink wine? After all, ancient Jewish wedding would last about a week. That's a lot of drinking. This leads us to have a fuller conversation about drunkenness in John chapter 2. How big of a deal is this to an ancient person? In the period right after the destruction of 70 AD, the few centuries that follow, we get Jewish texts like this one that says, back in the land of Israel, places like Galilee, those who became drunk and obnoxious were thrown out of the party. Jews like to imagine that when they were back in the land of Israel, people pretty much stayed sober, and if you didn't, you got thrown out of a party. But I think Keener is right when he says the following, that the banquet advisor here, that is here in John chapter 2, seems aware that at least a degree of excess occurs in the early stages of most weddings, may suggest that typical Galilean weddings were not as conservative as some later Judean teachers might have preferred. So yeah, we got a few verses here and there in Proverbs, and there's this kind of this self-consciousness later on that, hey, our forefathers and the people who live in the land of Israel, and we weren't all that drunk. But I think Keener is right that this story seems to suppose that the early stages of most Galilean weddings were not all that conservative. People were drinking. Now, it reminded me of a story I came across of involving a certain rabbi. Now, in this story, there is a woman whose husband sadly divorced her for barrenness, but told her that she could take the most precious object in his house and go back to her father's house. You have to leave. You haven't given me a child, but you can take anything here and you can take it back to your father's house because you have to move out. Well, she got her husband drunk at this point and then had him carried to her father's house, and explained when he woke up that he was the most precious object she could ever have. And so when Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai heard that what the wife had done, he prayed on the couple's behalf, and they were remembered by God, and he granted them to have children. I think stories like this from the early rabbinic tradition show a more balanced perspective on alcohol. Yeah, we do have the passages and Proverbs that say don't overdo it, but there's not like this strong compulsion to complete abstinence. Abstinence. If there was, you wouldn't have stories like the one I just communicated to you coming down to us in the early Jewish tradition. The final point I'd like to make about alcohol comes from Witherington. In North America, total abstinence is a position that arose out of all the problems created by excessive drinking in the 19th century, which led to the rise of various temperance movements. In the ancient world, wine was drunk instead of water at most every meal, including ritual meals like Passover, and Jesus participated in such meals. I bring this up for only one reason, not to be an advocate for imbibing wine, but because if one is going to be committed to the truth of God's Word, one must be honest about what God's Word does and does not say. In North America, there are all sorts of problems. Automobiles, firearms, these things make it very problematic when people drink too much. In early American history, Christmas was illegal for a little while because of all the drinking and the orgies and the chaos. There's a side to early American history that most modern Americans just aren't aware of. And we've had a lot of issues with alcohol in the United States. A lot of people die every year due to violence and drinking and driving. But in Jesus' time, what are you going to do? You're going to get drunk and wreck your camel? Is that the issue? You can't pull out your gun and shoot anyone, and you can't sword fight because you live under Roman occupation and no one's allowed to have a sword except a Roman soldier. And so it's just a totally different thing. And we don't want to take this story and use it to promote alcoholism. I'm an alcoholic myself, a recovering alcoholic. I take alcohol very seriously. I'm one of those guys who probably just needs to avoid alcohol pretty much completely. And, that's just my situation. But because of the problems of modern alcoholism, we don't want to transform this story into saying something it doesn't say. It doesn't put a complete moratorium on drinking alcohol, neither does it endorse overindulgence. The drunkenness just isn't the point of the story. That's just a side note. That's just extra. You're not supposed to think of it that way. What does the wine mean, spiritually speaking? And it seems to point to resurrection. Jesus the bridegroom. Clink, a powerful implication is suggested when the master of the banquet gives the bridegroom credit for what Jesus has done. Such an ironic depiction demands that Jesus be seen as fulfilling the role of bridegroom. This takes us back to our point about the first marriage of the Bible being on day 6 in the book of Genesis. And now this is the 6th day in John's gospel. And look at what happens later on in chapter 3. What John the Baptist says: the one who has the bride is the bridegroom, the friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. So the Baptist is going to say that he is the friend of the bridegroom, kind of like the best man. And he's going to say that Jesus is the bridegroom. Well, it's the bridegroom who supplied the wine at weddings. And now we can see that the bridegroom is getting credit for what Jesus has done. And Klink is right. This is implying that for the sake of John's gospel, Jesus is the true bridegroom, which of course builds on the Old Testament where Yahweh marries Israel. So now Jesus marries the church because Jesus is true Yahweh and the church is true Israel. This, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, I just want to point out when it says this is the beginning of the signs Jesus did, there is some vocabulary here that is very similar to in the beginning God made the heaven and the earth, which again means that we might be onto this 6-day thing, the wedding on the 6th day, looking back to the first wedding of the creation week. And again, Mount Sinai, just as the glory of the Lord was revealed to Israel at Mount Sinai, so too at Cana his glory revealed in this sign performed by the incarnate Word. Also, it says they saw this and they believed in him. The acceptable nature of the disciples' signs faith. You likely remember this slide from my first video on why the Gospel of John is so fascinating, that there are 3 types of faith. Miracles faith, belief based on miracles as far as they benefit the self, that is unacceptable. But signs faith, belief based on miracles that leads to a deeper interest in Jesus, that is acceptable. It is okay to have signs faith, but Jesus wants to move us to word faith, belief based on testimony about Jesus from reliable witnesses. Some people have signs faith. That's acceptable, though it's kind of unstable. But word faith is the best. And, here we see the disciples start with signs faith. But over their journey, they will arrive at word faith. Now, verse 12 is going to bring us into a conversation about Jesus' mother and his brothers, and the Protestant Catholic controversy concerning the perpetual virginity of Mary and whether or not Jesus had biological brothers. Verse 12. After this he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Now passages like this one and Mark 6:3, where Jesus has four brothers and they're named off: James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. This has been a problem for Catholics because they don't believe Jesus had these biological brothers. Mary, her entire life she was a virgin, and she didn't die. She was taken up to heaven as a virgin according to Catholic thinking. Now, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they also believe that Mary was a perpetual virgin, but they don't believe in the Assumption of Mary, that she was taken up into heaven without dying. In the Eastern Church, they believe in the death of Mary. And then, of course, in the Protestant Church, we tend to believe that Mary was a virgin until she had Jesus, and then she resumed, or rather had, normal marital interactions with her husband and had other children. As Burge says, he kind of represents a Protestant perspective. When the perpetual virginity of Mary became an affirmation in the 2nd century. Now notice what he's doing here. He's saying that Christians came up with this idea of Mary's perpetual virginity in the 2nd century, and that's why when you read 1st century documents like the Gospels, they just simply refer to the brothers of Jesus. They don't know of an issue here. They don't know anything about the perpetual virginity of Mary, and so that's why they say Jesus had brothers. This idea comes later in the 2nd century, according to Burge. Other views of verses like this came into use. These were either Joseph's children by previous marriage or Jesus' cousins. Protestants generally believe that Jesus had genuine siblings. Now, if I were a Catholic and I had to pick one of these views, if I had to choose, are these, his stepbrothers? Are they children of Joseph from a previous marriage, or are they Jesus' cousins? I would not go with the cousin route, because there is a Greek word that means cousin. You see it in Colossians. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Enepsios is the Greek word for cousin, and the word that is used of the brothers of Jesus in the Gospels is adelphos. And so, not the same word. It would be hard in the language to make this work. Sometimes people try to make this work by resorting to Hebrew, because in Hebrew, a brother can be a cousin, but that doesn't really matter because this is written in Greek, and Greek has different words for brothers and cousin. So you can't really make that work. So if I were Catholic, I would go with the notion that these are Joseph's children by previous marriage. Older men tended to marry younger women in the ancient world, and he could easily have been a widow and brought children into his marriage with Mary, and these would be Jesus' stepbrothers. So, again, if I were Catholic, that's the option I would choose. It would make a lot more historical sense to say that these are Jesus' cousins. That's just not very convincing when we consider these aspects of the Greek language. Now, what about Mary? What is her role in this gospel? What are we to take away from her? Well, I'm going to read this conclusion, and then I'm going to explain it. Mary is first Jesus' mother, indicating biological relations. Here, she and Jesus are with physical family and spiritual family. This is why it says, with disciples and with brothers. Right? Her and Jesus are with both groups, brothers and disciples. Jesus' brothers are going to prove to be unbelievers in chapter 7 and verse 5. And then you're going to get to John 19 at the cross. Mary will choose to be fully a part of Jesus' spiritual family, clinging to his disciples instead of her son. So remember the scene. Jesus is being crucified, and he tells Mary, who's standing next to John, "Behold your son," and he tells John, "Behold your mother." He turns the care of his mother over to his disciples. Now, you wouldn't expect that in the ancient world. You would expect her to be cared for by her other sons. But here she is. She hasn't made this choice yet. She's in chapter 1, and she is with both her other sons and with Jesus' disciples. But by the end of this gospel, she's going to have to pick what her closest family allegiances are. Is it to the disciples who believe in Jesus, or is it to her other sons who do not believe in Jesus? Well, in chapter 19, the choice is made. She goes with John, not with one of her kids. She picks the believing community over unbelievers, even though They are her family, whether you understand them to be her biological sons the way Protestants do, or just her legal sons the way that Catholics do. One way or the other, Augustine is right. That is her job. She models this kind of discipleship where you pick kingdom family over your unbelieving legal family. And so I think this is the best way to understand Mary. She has two scenes here. In the first scene, she is in both communities. She is a part of her immediate family who don't believe in Jesus, and she's a part of these disciples. By the end of the gospel, she's just with the disciples. That's what she does. She shows for us the importance of picking kingdom over unbelieving family, a point that has to stick in each one of our lives. In Luke's gospel, he tries very hard to let you know just because you're a good family man doesn't mean that you're going to heaven, as it were, that you are saved. That in fact, there are a lot of family men who are going to hell because you have to pick kingdom over everything, Jesus over everything, including your family. This point is made many times. There are a lot of different summaries and conclusions, but I think the best one is here from Martin and Wright, and I will read their summary and bring this to a close. Through his prophets, the Lord promised a definitive act of salvation by which he would redeem his people from sin and renew the covenant. This new covenant was likened to a marriage between God and his redeemed people, and in this new perfected state of affairs, God would meet and vastly exceed his people's needs, such that no one would want for anything. Hence the prophets described it as a time of great prosperity, including such things as a superabundance of good wine. In this seemingly simple event at a wedding, John invites us to see a great mystery. God's great in-time act of salvation to fulfill his promises and renew his covenant is being accomplished in his son Jesus. God's covenant marriage with his people on the third day at Sinai is being renewed in the eschatological marriage of the Messiah with his people, personified by his mother on the third day at Cana. The water of the Sinai covenant is not being thrown out, but it is being transposed into the wine of the gospel in the new context of the word made flesh.